crucial topic. We're not even 1 year into a 4-year term for a president who is turning 80, and so these things matter to all Americans. Dr. Coleman, this was not a routine disclosure. It was a sweeping organ-by-organ declaration they put out that said everything is quote-unquote perfectly normal. All right, you're looking at this through a doctor's eyes. When they finally put this report out, obviously it took over a month. What do you see in the report?
Well, usually they start with the reason for the test, and he stated that it was preventive. There's nothing preventive about doing an imaging test. An imaging test, advanced imaging, is to diagnose a condition, either that you have it and treat it or you rule it out. So there's nothing preventive about it.
But they never.
Okay, so something absolutely massive just happened, and the White House is in complete chaos right now. We're getting reports that Donald Trump allegedly experienced what sources are calling a severe medical emergency, and doctors are reportedly scrambling to manage a situation that could fundamentally reshape American politics heading into 2026. This isn't just another health scare that gets brushed aside with a brief statement and a photo op. This is something that has the entire executive branch on high alert, Republicans in full panic mode behind closed doors, and Democrats quietly preparing for scenarios that nobody wants to talk about publicly. The implications here go way beyond just one man's health. We're talking about constitutional succession protocols, the stability of ongoing policy initiatives, international confidence in American leadership, and the very real possibility that the political landscape could be completely transformed overnight. The next few hours and days are going to be absolutely critical, and what we're seeing right now could define the remainder of this presidency and set the stage for 2026 in ways that nobody anticipated. Now, before we get into what actually happened and why this matters so much more than the headlines are letting on, let's talk about something important. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. They're either going to downplay this to avoid causing panic, or they're going to sensationalize it without giving you the real context you need to understand what's actually at stake. That's exactly why we built Politic Insane, to bring you real stories, real context, and absolutely no corporate spin. We're not here to tell you what to think. We're here to give you the information you need to think for yourself. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines and get the kind of deep analysis that actually explains what's happening behind the scenes, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now. We bring the news straight to you every single day, covering the stories that matter and connecting the dots that mainstream outlets either miss or deliberately ignore. Just hit the subscribe button below to join us. And if you want to support this work and be part of a community that truly cares about the truth, about understanding the real mechanisms of power and how decisions get made in Washington, this is your moment. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and let us know in the comments what you think is really going on here. Your voice matters, and we want to hear from you. All right, let's get back to the video. Here's what happened. According to multiple sources close to the situation, Trump was at Mar-a-Lago when he reportedly experienced what medical personnel are describing as a severe and sudden medical event. The exact nature of the emergency is still unclear. There are conflicting reports circulating about whether this was cardiac-related, neurological, or something else entirely, but what we do know is that doctors were called immediately, that the response was urgent, and that the situation was serious enough to trigger emergency protocols that are typically reserved for life-threatening scenarios. Within minutes of the incident, Secret Service agents reportedly cleared areas of the resort, medical personnel arrived on scene, and senior White House officials were notified. The vice president was briefed. The cabinet was put on alert. Congressional leadership from both parties received calls. This wasn't a routine checkup gone slightly wrong. This was a full-scale medical emergency response, and the speed and intensity of the reaction tells you everything you need to know about how seriously this was taken in real time. Now, here's where things start to get even more complicated. The White House has been notably silent. There's been no official statement from the press secretary, no reassuring tweet from Trump himself, no photo of him looking healthy and smiling to calm everyone down. That silence is deafening, and it's setting off alarm bells across Washington. In the age of social media, when Trump has historically been quick to dismiss any negative story or health concern with a rapid-fire response, the absence of any communication is raising serious questions about what's actually happening behind closed doors. People inside the administration are reportedly scrambling to figure out what they can say, what they should say, and what the legal and political implications are of saying anything at all. Because here's the thing. If Trump is genuinely incapacitated, even temporarily, there are constitutional procedures that are supposed to kick in. The 25th Amendment exists precisely for situations like this, where the president is unable to discharge the powers and duties of the office. But invoking the 25th Amendment is an enormous deal. It's a political nuclear option that has massive implications for the balance of power for the president's authority going forward and for the 2026 midterms. So the White House is caught in this impossible position where they need to be transparent about the president's condition, but they also don't want to trigger a constitutional crisis or give ammunition to political opponents who will inevitably use any sign of weakness to argue that Trump is unfit to serve. And it gets worse. International allies are watching this unfold in real time, and they're deeply concerned about what it means for American leadership on the global stage. We're in the middle of ongoing negotiations with Ukraine over continued military aid. There are delicate discussions happening with European partners about trade policy and NATO commitments. There are sensitive intelligence operations that require presidential authorization, and there are adversaries like Russia, China, and Iran who are absolutely paying attention to any indication that the United States might be distracted or weakened by domestic turmoil. If Trump is genuinely incapacitated, even for a short period, that creates a window of vulnerability that adversaries can exploit. It raises questions about who's actually making decisions, whether the chain of command is functioning properly, and whether the United States can be relied upon to follow through on its commitments. Foreign ministers in European capitals are reportedly making quiet calls to their American counterparts, trying to get a sense of what's really happening and what it means for their own national security. Markets are already starting to react. Investors hate uncertainty, and the prospect of a sudden change in American leadership, or even just temporary instability at the top, is enough to cause volatility in global financial markets. We're seeing futures drop, currency fluctuations, and analysts frantically trying to model out what happens if this situation escalates. But let's step back and understand the broader context here, because this isn't happening in a vacuum. Trump has been under enormous pressure on multiple fronts. He's facing ongoing legal challenges, including criminal prosecutions, civil lawsuits, and investigations into everything from his business dealings to his handling of classified documents to his actions surrounding January 6th. He's been dealing with internal Republican divisions, with moderate members of his own party increasingly willing to push back against his more extreme policy positions, and with MAGA loyalists demanding absolute fealty, even when it conflicts with political pragmatism. He's been managing a contentious relationship with the judiciary, where judges at every level have been pushing back against executive overreach and ruling against administration policies on everything from immigration to federal funding to emergency powers. And he's been navigating an incredibly complex international environment where traditional allies are skeptical of American reliability, adversaries are testing American resolve, and every decision has massive geopolitical implications. The cumulative stress of all of this, combined with Trump's age, he's in his late 70s, his well-documented diet and lifestyle, and the inherent demands of the presidency, creates a situation where health concerns are not just plausible, but almost inevitable. Now, let's talk about what the law actually says about presidential succession and incapacity, because this is where things get really interesting and really complicated. The 25th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified in 1967, largely in response to the assassination of President Kennedy and the recognition that the country needed clear procedures for what happens when a president dies, resigns, or becomes unable to perform the duties of the office. Section 3 of the amendment allows the president to voluntarily transfer power to the vice president by submitting a written declaration to Congress stating that he's unable to discharge his duties. This has been used a handful of times in American history, most notably when presidents have undergone medical procedures requiring anesthesia, and it's designed to be a straightforward temporary transfer of power that can be reversed as soon as the president is able to resume his duties. But here's the problem. This requires the president to voluntarily acknowledge that he's incapacitated, and anyone who's followed Trump's career knows that he's not exactly known for admitting weakness or vulnerability. The idea that Trump would willingly sign a document saying he can't do his job, even temporarily, seems politically and psychologically implausible. He's built his entire brand on strength, dominance, and the ability to overcome any obstacle, and admitting incapacity would be seen as a fatal blow to that image. That brings us to Section 4 of the 25th Amendment, which is the nuclear option. Section 4 allows the vice president and a majority of the cabinet to declare that the president is unable to discharge his duties, essentially removing him from power without his consent. This has never been invoked in American history. It's the constitutional equivalent of a coup within the executive branch, and it would trigger an immediate political and legal crisis. If the vice president and the cabinet were to invoke Section 4, the president could challenge it by submitting his own written declaration that he is, in fact, capable of performing his duties. At that point, Congress would have to decide, and it would require a two-thirds vote in both the House and the Senate to keep the president removed from power. You can imagine how politically explosive that would be. Republicans would be forced to choose between loyalty to Trump and their constitutional duty to assess his fitness for office. Democrats would be accused of orchestrating a power grab, even if they had nothing to do with the initial decision by the cabinet. The entire country would be consumed by a debate over presidential fitness. With medical experts, constitutional scholars, and political operatives all weighing in, and the ultimate decision would come down to a handful of votes in Congress that could go either way depending on how the political winds are blowing, and here's where this becomes a lot bigger than just a health scare. If Trump is genuinely incapacitated, or if there's even a serious question about his fitness to serve, it fundamentally reshapes the 2026 midterms and the 2028 presidential race. Republicans who have been walking a tightrope trying to maintain their own political viability while not alienating Trump's base would suddenly have to make a choice. Do they stick with Trump and risk being associated with a president who's medically unfit? Do they pivot to the vice president and try to position themselves as part of a new generation of Republican leadership? Do they use this as an opportunity to distance themselves from Trump entirely and try to reclaim the party for a more traditional conservative agenda? Every decision has risks, and every decision alienates some portion of the Republican coalition. Democrats, meanwhile, would be in an equally complicated position. On the one hand, they'd have an enormous political advantage if Trump is weakened or unable to serve. On the other hand, they'd have to be incredibly careful not to appear to be capitalizing on a medical emergency or to be seen as celebrating someone's health problems, because that would backfire spectacularly with voters who value decency and empathy. The entire political landscape would shift overnight, and campaigns that have been planning their strategies for months or years would have to completely recalibrate. Okay, let's break down what this actually means across multiple dimensions, because the implications here are staggering. First, understand that presidential health is not just a personal matter, it's a matter of national security. The president has access to the nuclear codes, he has the authority to order military strikes, he has the power to negotiate treaties and make commitments on behalf of the United States, and he has the responsibility to respond to crises in real time. If the president is incapacitated, even temporarily, that creates a dangerous gap in the chain of command. Who's making the decisions? Is the vice president fully briefed and empowered to act? Are cabinet members and military leaders confident that orders coming from the White House are legitimate and properly authorized? These aren't hypothetical questions. In a world where adversaries are constantly probing for weakness, where conflicts can escalate in minutes, and where a single miscommunication can have catastrophic consequences, presidential incapacity is a genuine national security threat. And that's exactly why the 25th Amendment exists, to ensure that there's always someone clearly and unambiguously in charge, even if that means temporarily removing a president from power. Second, this has massive implications for the judiciary and ongoing legal battles. Trump is currently a defendant in multiple criminal cases, and his defense strategy has relied heavily on arguments about presidential immunity, executive privilege, and the practical difficulties of prosecuting a sitting president. If Trump is incapacitated, or if there's a serious question about his fitness to stand trial, that throws all of those cases into legal limbo. Defense attorneys will argue that their client is unable to participate in his own defense, that proceeding with trials would violate his constitutional rights, and that the cases should be delayed indefinitely. Prosecutors will argue that justice delayed is justice denied, that Trump's health issues are convenient timing given the legal pressure he's under, and that the public has a right to see these cases resolved. Judges will be caught in the middle trying to balance constitutional protections for defendants with the public interest in accountability, and whatever they decide will be appealed immediately and potentially end up at the Supreme Court. This could drag on for years, consuming enormous amounts of judicial resources and keeping Trump in the headlines even if he's no longer actively governing. Third, there's the question of what happens to Trump's policy agenda. The administration has been pushing forward on multiple fronts, from immigration enforcement to deregulation to tax policy to foreign policy initiatives, and all of that depends on Trump being actively engaged and able to drive his agenda forward. If Trump is incapacitated even temporarily, that creates an opening for opponents within his own administration, within Congress, and within the judiciary to push back, delay, or outright block policies that they disagree with. You'll see regulatory agencies slow-walking controversial rules. You'll see congressional Republicans using this as an excuse to distance themselves from unpopular positions. You'll see judges feeling emboldened to rule against the administration because they don't have to worry about direct retaliation from a president who's distracted or weakened. The entire machinery of government grinds to a halt, or at least slows down significantly, and that has real-world consequences for millions of Americans who are depending on government services, protections, and programs. Fourth, this absolutely reshapes the 2026 midterms. Republicans were already facing a difficult electoral map, with control of the House and Senate up for grabs and voters increasingly skeptical of Trump's leadership. If Trump is incapacitated, or if there's even a lingering question about his health and fitness, that becomes the defining issue of the midterms. Democratic candidates will run on a platform of stability, competence, and the need for leadership that voters can trust. They'll argue that Republicans put party loyalty above the country's interests by not invoking the 25th Amendment when it was clearly warranted. They'll point to the chaos and uncertainty of this period as evidence that the Trump administration was never fit to govern. Republican candidates, meanwhile, will be caught between defending Trump to avoid alienating his base and distancing themselves to appeal to swing voters who are concerned about leadership and stability. Every candidate will have to take a position on whether Trump should have stepped down, whether the 25th Amendment should have been invoked, and whether the party needs new leadership going forward. Those are incredibly difficult questions to answer in a way that appeals to both the MAGA base and the broader electorate, and the result will likely be that Republicans lose seats in both the House and the Senate, potentially giving Democrats unified control of government heading into 2028. Fifth, let's talk about the international dimension, because this is where things get really dangerous. America's adversaries are absolutely paying attention to this, and they're looking for any opportunity to exploit weakness or distraction. If Trump is incapacitated, you can bet that China is going to test American resolve in the South China Sea, that Russia is going to push harder in Ukraine and potentially make moves in Eastern Europe, that Iran is going to escalate its nuclear program and its support for regional proxies, and that North Korea is going to resume missile tests and provocations. Why? Because they understand that the United States is at its most vulnerable when there's uncertainty about who's in charge and what the response will be to aggression. They've studied American history, they know how the 25th Amendment works, and they know that a president who's fighting for his political survival or recovering from a medical emergency is not going to be focused on foreign policy. That creates a window of opportunity that adversaries will absolutely try to exploit, and the consequences could be catastrophic. We could see military conflicts that wouldn't have happened otherwise, diplomatic setbacks that take years to recover from, and a fundamental erosion of American credibility on the global stage. Sixth, there's the economic impact, and this is something that doesn't get enough attention in these discussions. Markets hate uncertainty, and the prospect of presidential incapacity, potential invocation of the 25th Amendment, and a possible constitutional crisis is about as uncertain as it gets. Investors are going to pull back from risky assets. You're going to see volatility in stock markets, currency fluctuations, and a general flight to safety. That means higher borrowing costs for businesses and consumers, slower economic growth, potential job losses, and a real impact on people's retirement accounts, savings, and financial security. If the uncertainty drags on for weeks or months, you could see a significant economic slowdown or even a recession. And here's the thing. Trump has staked his entire political identity on economic success, on delivering growth and jobs and prosperity. If the economy tanks because of questions about his health and fitness, that undermines his core argument for why voters should support him and his party. It creates an opening for Democrats to argue that the chaos and instability of the Trump administration is actively harming American families. And that's a message that resonates across party lines. Seventh, let's talk about what happens inside the Republican Party, because this could trigger a civil war that's been brewing for years. You have MAGA loyalists who are absolutely convinced that any move against Trump including invoking the 25th Amendment for legitimate medical reasons, is part of a deep state conspiracy to remove him from power. They'll see this as a betrayal. They'll demand absolute loyalty to Trump no matter what, and they'll threaten to primary any Republican who doesn't fall in line. On the other side, you have traditional conservatives, national security Republicans, and business oriented members of the party who are increasingly uncomfortable with Trump's leadership and see this as an opportunity to move the party in a different direction. They'll argue that the party needs to prioritize governance over personality, that Trump's health issues are a legitimate concern that can't be ignored for political reasons, and that the country's interests have to come before any one individual's political career. The battle between these factions will play out in primaries, in fundraising, in media coverage, and ultimately at the ballot box. And the result will determine whether the Republican Party remains the party of Trump or becomes something else entirely. Eighth, there's the question of precedent. If the 25th Amendment is invoked, or even if there's a serious public debate about whether it should be invoked, that sets a precedent for future presidents. It establishes that presidential health is not just a private matter, but a legitimate topic for public discussion and constitutional action. It clarifies the threshold for when a president should step aside, either voluntarily or involuntarily, and it empowers vice presidents and cabinet members to act when they believe the president is unable to fulfill his duties. That's a good thing for democracy and for the functioning of government, but it's also something that will be fiercely resisted by presidents and their allies who see it as a threat to executive power. Every future president will have to contend with the possibility that their health, their mental acuity, their fitness for office could become grounds for removal, and that will change the calculus around transparency, medical disclosures, and the relationship between the president and his cabinet. Ninth, let's talk about what this means for the vice president, because this is where the rubber really meets the road. If Trump is incapacitated, the vice president is suddenly thrust into a position of enormous power and responsibility. Everything he does or doesn't do in the coming hours and days will define his political career and potentially his legacy. If he moves too quickly to invoke the 25th Amendment, he'll be accused of staging a coup and betraying Trump. If he moves too slowly, he'll be accused of putting Trump's interests above the country's interests and failing in his constitutional duty. He has to balance loyalty to Trump with responsibility to the nation, and there's no playbook for how to do that. He'll be under intense scrutiny from the media, from Congress, from foreign leaders, and from the American public, all of whom will be watching to see whether he's capable of leading in a crisis. If he handles this well, he could emerge as the frontrunner for the Republican nomination in 2028. If he handles it poorly, his political career could be over. The stakes could not be higher, and the pressure on him right now is unimaginable. 10th, there's the simple human element of all of this. Regardless of your political views, regardless of whether you support Trump or oppose him, this is a man who's reportedly experiencing a severe medical emergency. He's someone's father, someone's grandfather, someone's husband, and the decent response is to hope that he gets the medical care he needs and that he recovers fully. At the same time, the office of the presidency is bigger than any one person, and the country's interests have to come first. That's the fundamental tension at the heart of this situation. We can care about Trump as a human being while also recognizing that the country needs leadership that's active, engaged, and capable of making critical decisions in real time. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive, but they create a difficult emotional and political landscape that everyone is going to have to navigate over the coming days and weeks. So here's the bottom line. This is a full-blown crisis for the White House, for the Republican Party, and potentially for the country. If Trump is genuinely incapacitated, we're looking at a constitutional process that has never been fully tested, a political battle that will consume Washington for months, and a period of uncertainty that will have real consequences for national security, the economy, and America's standing in the world. If Trump recovers quickly, and this turns out to be a brief scare, it will still raise serious questions about his health, his fitness for office, and whether voters can trust him to serve out his term. Either way, this is a defining moment. It's the kind of event that historians will look back on as a turning point, where the trajectory of American politics shifted in ways that nobody fully anticipated. Like, the next few days are going to be absolutely critical. We need to watch what the White House says or doesn't say. We need to watch whether the vice president takes any action under the 25th Amendment. We need to watch how congressional leaders from both parties respond. We need to watch how international allies and adversaries react, and we need to watch how this plays out in the court of public opinion because ultimately, the American people are going to decide whether this administration can continue, whether Trump should step aside, and what kind of leadership they want going forward. This story is far from over. In fact, it's probably just beginning. Keep your eyes on this because what happens next could define not just the remainder of this presidency, but the entire next decade of American politics. The balance of power is shifting in real time, and the decisions made in the coming hours and days will echo for years to come. This is the moment where everything changes, where the assumptions we've been operating under for the past several years are suddenly thrown into question, and where the future becomes fundamentally uncertain. Stay informed, stay engaged, and make sure you're getting your news from sources that give you the full picture, not just the sanitized version that serves someone's political agenda. The truth matters, context matters, and understanding what's really at stake matters more than ever.